Welcome to a couple of bunkies. Several months ago, our baby started crawling around. At that time, we knew it was time to start designing a baby pen. We wanted to make our own baby pen that would match our decor and have sections that can be used later, like in a bed or in gates around the house. But first, we're going to have to design it. My wife and I use ViaCAD to do most of our drawings. We wanted the inner area to be that of a queen-size mattress. So I started off with drawing the dimensions of a queen-size mattress on ViaCAD. Then we worked out the size of the upper and lower horizontal bars. And I used the linear duplication tool in order to repeat the vertical bars. This really helped us work out the spacing between each of the horizontal bars. I wanted to make it a little bit more fancier by having the end columns made out of walnut, just like we did our baby bed. If you're interested in checking out that video, it should be in the upper right hand corner. And now I wanted to work out a hinge mechanism that I could make with the laser engraver. Right now on the drawing, it's basically just a prototype, and we'll make it much better later. I was hoping that I could use the same hinge design when applying it to the gates and for the future bed. But now that I have an idea on how big the size of the hinges are and the space needed between the columns, I can make a top-down design of the area to make sure that it fits around that queen-size bed. Now I print out the designs and the cut list. We had worked it out so they would both fit a queen-size bed and a twin bed, with some of the parts removed to make baby gates around the house. I start off by getting the cherry lumber ready with the planer. Now that I have the majority of cherry boards together, I can start preparing the walnut boards that are going to be used for the vertical columns. To make my life a little easier, I cut them to size before going to the planer. Walnut is one of my favorite types of wood, and I don't like to waste it. Now that I had all the walnut accounted for, I could take it to the table saw. Some of my rough side lumber had a little bit of a cup in it. It was best to resaw the lumber and then take it to the planer. The walnut columns really make this whole project stand out. After the walnut boards were planed down, the corner columns were going to be 1.5 inches by 30 inches. So I took the wood to the table saw to cut out pieces around 1.5 inches. Now I can glue up all 16 of these columns. I used some 1/4 inch plywood in order to prevent the glue dripping on my table saw. I ended up using a new glue bottle for this part. Ended up getting it for sale, and I gotta say I ended up throwing it out on the third project after this because it ended up getting gummed up. I group the columns the best I can and clamp them together. And set them on my gluing table in the other room. And I do the same process for the other walnut columns. Now I can start working on the top and bottom horizontal slats, but first I need to square up the lumber. From this cherry I need 4 top rails at 36 inches, about 1.75 inches in width. And we need 4 22-inch ones, and we need 8 34-inch ones. After I get the wood cut to length, I set up my router table. I believe I use a 1/4-inch roundover bit, and I go over all of the boards that I have available. Since this is going to be part of a nursery, I really want to use as many rounded edges as possible. Now I should have probably done this part earlier, but I use a miter gauge in order to cut the final dimensions of the top and bottom railings. Next part, I cut a groove in the center of the railings. This groove will hold all of the vertical bars. Now I can square up the walnut columns that I had glued up earlier. These columns are 1.5 inches, and there are 16 columns in total. Now I can use the miter gauge and cut off the excess on the upper and bottom parts. The side columns are 30 inches long. Now I can set up the router table and round over the walnut columns. And repeat the same process for all 16 columns. I also need to round over the top and bottom of the columns. And I do the same thing to the cherry pieces that were cut earlier. Now I'm going to make all of the bars. I had calculated from the drawing that I should need 100 vertical bars. This would allow 2.5 inches between the bars. The vertical bars are 26 inches in length. Now I sand over all of the pieces that I'm working on. I start off sanding with 80 grit sandpaper and work my way up to 220. Now I drill a small hole in each of the boards and attach a hook so I can hang it up on the wall. I use a clear coat of polyurethane on each of the boards. I apply 2 to 3 coats of poly with sanding in between. Now I round over all of the bars I made earlier with the router table. And after a quick set of sanding, I apply the same coats of poly that I do with the rest of the pieces. Now I can start gluing all of the bars onto the rails. I do this with 2.5-inch spacers, and I work my way from the middle out. I clamp up the sections and then set it out to dry. And I repeat the same process for all 8 sections. And we need a total of 8 sections. I don't want to have any wood screws or any metal in this project, so I have a dowel center jig, and I use another jig that I made with plywood in order to line the holes so I can start attaching the walnut columns. I also used these wind dowels that did the trick. I used my handmade jig with the centering jig from Amazon in order to cut the holes in the walnut columns before installing them onto the gate. Once the jig is where I want it to be, I tighten the self-centering dowel jig and clamp my jig onto the piece of walnut. Making sure to set the drill bit collar so you don't accidentally go all the way through the walnut board. I proceed to drill the first hole. I untighten the centering jig and remove it. I add a dowel rod to the handmade jig so it holds it into place. And I shift my clamp over to the other side of the walnut board. And attach the centering jig on the other side of the walnut board. And I drill the final hole. And I repeat this step for all 16 walnut columns. And since the alignment's the same, I use the same handmade jig in order to drill the holes into the top and bottom rails. After the holes were drilled, I was able to add some glue to some dowels and just insert it and push everything into place. And after a lot of repetition, I made all of the gates. But now I need to make the hinges. Now, I made the design in ViaCAD earlier, and I just need to export this image as a DXF file and import the file into Inkscape. Now I move the hinge design to the cutting area. Now I switch the outline color to 255 red. This tells my laser engraver machine to cut on the outline. Now I can go ahead and make multiples of the object in order to cut out with the laser engraver. Now I save this file as an SVG file and run the file on my laser engraver. We have an affiliate link with Monport Laser. Use the link below and use the promo code Timothy10 at checkout. I use the vector cut setting. So I resaw all my own wood, and I'm using about a 1/4 inch cherry for this project. And I ended up doubling up on the cherry. I'm going to make the suggestion to try to cut this out with maybe a PVC or maybe some kind of vinyl, or even some plywood where the grain is in multiple directions. Just the presence of a barrier encouraged my child to rip apart this barrier, and one of the weakest parts were these hinges. I also updated the file on these pieces so they would be more like puzzle pieces that I can combine together. In fact, I could rotate them so they would be put together without any glue or anything like that on both sides of the columns. Now that I have a bunch of these pieces cut out, I use CA glue and accelerator in order to glue together both sides of the puzzle pieces. And I'm able to combine 4 pieces in order to make one piece of the hinge. And repeat the process in order to get all of the hinges I need in order to make this project. For this, I need 2 hinge pairs for each corner. And I need 2 of these brackets that I made for the center areas. Having the center of the pen held with these brackets ended up making it much more sturdier than having all of them have hinges holding everything together. After they were all glued together, I added some poly and set them out to dry. Now all I need to do is make the pins in order to put all of these hinges together. I made a handful of bead designs for my son's cradle. Link in the description. In this process we used the Legacy Ornamental Mill. Here's a quick clip on how I made it from that video. I set up the Legacy Ornamental Mill with 2 cranks, one moving in the Y direction every 4 turns equaling 1 inch, and the other one rotating the spindle. The x-axis is controlled by the knob on the gantry. I was able to keep the project on the Legacy Ornamental Mill in order to sand it, and to apply the first coat of polyurethane. After letting these spindles dry, I ended up making a dunk tank for my polyurethane in order to add the next 3 coats. I also used my walking stick hanging jigs in order to allow them to cure. I had 2 designs in mind, a barbell and a pen. Depending on how easily I wanted to be able to take apart that section. So I would cut a section of the bead design made earlier, and then I would remove one of the beads. I would use a 3 bead section and remove the center one for the barbell design, and I would remove the end one with a 2 bead section to make the pin. And I would carefully sand it round so it would fit inside of the hinge. And here's an up-close example of how the puzzle piece mechanism works. Quickly, while my baby is asleep, I'll go ahead and start putting together this playpen. The gate was made with 2 barbells on one side and a single pin on the other holding it together. And here's a tour of my toddler's playpen. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. As I had stated earlier, I had made this pen to come apart in certain ways so that it would match a twin-size mattress and that it could be used for gates throughout the house. So stay tuned for more videos to come where I'll be utilizing this playpen when it's no longer needed.